Well, from Princeton University professor Richard Falk, who blames America for the 9/11 attacks and the Boston Marathon bombing, to domestic terrorist Bernardine Dohrn, who bombed America repeatedly and wound up teaching at Northwestern University Law School. Throughout our nation, college professors, some of them self-described anarchists, are teaching our students to hate America. Few of those professors are ever publicly challenged on those lessons, until tonight, as we bring you part one of my exclusive interview with former University of Colorado professor Ward Churchill.
He made national headlines for suggesting the 9/11 victims deserved to die. A respected university professor, calling nearly 3,000 murdered Americans, quote, little Eichmanns, comparing them to an infamous Nazi.
They made the system work by which profit is maximized at the expense of starving and dying children and other people in the third world. It's a matter of business as usual. This total amoral technical function being performed. That's Eichmann-like in my mind.
That's how America first came to know the University of Colorado's Ward Churchill. Born in 1947, Churchill came of age in the 60s. He was drafted by the Army in 1966, spending close to a year in Vietnam.
What happened over there?
Carnage is what happened over there. Was it genocide? Well, we could debate that one, but it was certainly a genocidal process.
He returned from the war a radical and an enemy sympathizer.
I woke up one morning in 1968, shortly after arriving, and realized I was on the wrong side.
Back stateside, Churchill quickly joined the Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, a hardcore anti-war organization boasting members like Bill Ayers. Ayers, another 60s radical, would later become a domestic terrorist, founding a group that bombed the State Department, Pentagon, and more than a dozen other buildings, all in protest of the war and other far-left causes. Churchill admits that around this time, he taught Ayers' group, then known as the Weathermen, how to make bombs and fire weapons.
I had trained weathermen. Okay. You know, it was pretty basic kind of training. I did workshops with pacifists on demystification of the assault rifle. Okay, you can't be a pacifist if you're not capable of inflicting violence.
In 1978, Churchill began lecturing on American Indian Studies at the University of Colorado. By the 90s, he had received tenure. And then came September 11, 2001. Hours after the attacks, with smoke still smoldering amidst the carnage, Churchill penned an essay on the justice of roosting chickens. Full of rage about what he called past American war crimes, Churchill compared the victims to Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann, a man who sent millions of Jews to the gas chamber, suggesting the dead Americans had helped grease the wheels of an immoral U.S. foreign policy. Quote, as to those in the World Trade Center, well, really, let's get a grip here, shall we? True enough, they were civilians of a sort, but innocent? Give me a break. They formed a technocratic core at the very heart of America's global financial empire. It was an accusation he would later repeat in an HBO documentary.
If there is a better or more efficient way to impose consequences on the little Eichmanns composing the technocratic core of American empire, I'd really like to hear it.
His incendiary writings went unnoticed for years, until New York's respected Hamilton College invited him to speak in 2005. The essay resurfaced, and outrage followed.
I mean, this is just cruel to say these people deserved it. They were little Nazis, which is what Churchill says, that these people in the World Trade Center at the Pentagon were little Nazis. And you know, one of their sons is at Hamilton. How brutal is this?
Hamilton College rescinded the invitation. In the meantime, Churchill's own employer, besieged by angry alumni and faculty, started looking into Churchill's comments. The university concluded this was protected speech, but not long after, it accused Churchill of unrelated academic misconduct. He claimed the charges were a ruse to fire him. In July 2007, the university cut him loose. Churchill's attorney filed suit, portraying the professor as the victim of a witch hunt.
It was an absolute mob mentality. Bill O'Reilly was all over War Churchill. Rush Limbaugh, all over it.
2 years later, the jury ruled for Churchill, awarding him, though, just $1 in damages. The judge overturned the verdict in Churchill's favor. Churchill appealed and lost every challenge. In the 5 years since, he's been mostly writing, never retracting his inflammatory statements. Now living in Atlanta, Churchill still believes America is a force for evil.
So who's the new evil empire?
Well, you're sitting in it.
Ward Churchill is the former University of Colorado professor. Thank you for being here. So the day of the 9/11 attacks, you wrote an essay and referred to the 9/11 victims as little Eichmanns, writing, quote, "If there was a better, more effective, or in fact any other way of visiting some penalty befitting their participation upon the little Eichmanns inhabiting the sterile sanctuary of the Twin Towers, I'd really be interested in hearing about it." How could you draw a moral equivalence between 3,000 dead Americans and a murderous Nazi like Adolf Eichmann?
Well, first off, I did not make a reference to 3,000 Americans in that connection. I made a reference to what I described as a technocratic core of empire, which was a particular group within that 3,000.
The folks in the Twin Towers.
Twin Towers, there was also a body count at the Pentagon that day. So we have two separate groups here, but within that there are various subgroups. And I'm not quite sure that you could describe a food service worker or janitorial staff or passersby as being part of a technocratic core of anything. So self-evidently I was referring to a particular subgroup or particular subgroups.
Okay, so you exclude the firefighters, the police, the janitors, the folks who are not working in the financial services industry.
Yeah, if there's some definition that you can apply to them that would make them technocrats, I'd have to revise that, but
okay.
I can't think of one.
Then let's talk about the folks to whom you do assign some blame or who you were suggesting in some way deserved the attack. How on earth could you say that?
Essentially in the same way that the United States government and the military have designate these as legitimate targets. We're talking about command and control infrastructure. We're talking about the ability of an opposing power, a hostile power.
Our military doesn't target civilian facilities. They may target dual facilities that serve both the military and other purpose, but they do not intentionally target civilians, as the terrorists did to us on 9/11.
Quite the contrary. You have actual projections that are made prior to strikes as to what the quantity of collateral damage will be. So it's done with full knowledge that there's going to be civilian casualties,
but we try to avoid them. We try to avoid civilian
casualties. What does that mean? What exactly does try to avoid them mean when you're attacking a target in full knowledge that you're going to inflict this so-called collateral damage, and you take that as an acceptable price to pay?
I want to get to what specifically you said about wait 1 second, I'm going to give you the floor. What specifically you said about the financial workers who were in the World Trade Center, because when I read your words written on the day of the attack, I mean, while the bodies were still smoldering, it sounded like you had a disdain for these Americans, and this is what you wrote. To the extent that any of them were unaware of the costs and consequences to others of what they were involved in, it was because of their absolute refusal to see. More likely, it was because they were too busy braying incessantly and self-importantly into their cell phones, arranging power lunches and stock transactions, each of which translated conveniently out of sight, mind, and smelling distance into the starved and rotting flesh of infants. You sound like not only do you blame them, but that you dislike them.
What I'm saying is, for effect, in essence, the message is, this is what it feels like to be treated this way.
What was their sin? Was it
Their
making
sin,
money? Why do you draw a distinction between them and the firefighters, them and the police, them and the janitors?
Because they are proactively involved and knowingly involved, lending their proficiencies to the process which is served by the U.S. military, which is served by this projection of force upon the planet.
The process is making money. The process of making money. That's what every American with a job does. That's what you did when you worked at the University of Colorado, pulling in 6 figures a year. You made money. And the American military is funded by taxes from individuals and businesses. You make money one way or you make money another way. There are ways to make money which are criminally sanctioned. But
Okay?
Professor Churchill, you're too smart to believe that. The American military is funded by taxes. My taxes, your taxes.
That's correct.
Taxes paid by the folks who worked in the World Trade Center. Money is fungible, and we all funded those actions, not just those folks. You too.
Did I say I was innocent? Yeah, I understand. My taxes go into that, and I resist it, I reject it, I oppose it, I do what I can to bring it to a halt, which is probably not sufficient because I have not been successful.
Let's talk about the Little Eichmann's reference, because that's one of the pieces of what you wrote that got people so upset. Adolf Eichmann, you described him as a technocrat within the Nazi army.
Bureaucrat would work too. But
The Nuremberg trials found him in charge of the extermination program against the Jews. He was the one in charge of the final solution, which was eliminate all the Jews. They don't think he was a technocrat of any sort. And so for you to compare these dead Americans to one of the worst, most bloodthirsty Nazis of World War II incensed a lot of people.
Well, I don't know whether you've read the Nuremberg proceedings. I have, and that's not what they said. They said he was in charge, essentially, of the logistical apparatus and the programs, the formulation of the programs and implementation of programs for the roundups and so forth. Reinhard Heydrich was in charge of the final solution.
So he was just
a
paper pusher, as far as you're concerned.
Essentially, that's correct.
Okay, but what I did read was his own words, because he, the viewers should know, actually escaped after the war and took refuge in Argentina under a different name before he was ultimately captured by the Mossad, the Israeli forces, and put to death, the only man in the history of Israel to be put to death by execution. But what he said while he was in hiding in Argentina is as follows. Number one, he said, quote, "You know, I called my men into my Berlin office and formally took leave of them. If it has to be, I told them, I will gladly jump into my grave in the knowledge that 5 million enemies of the Reich have already died like animals." He went on to say, quote, "To sum it all up, I regret nothing. I recognize Hitler joyfully, and I still defend him. I will not humble myself or repent in any way. I must say truthfully that if we had killed all the 10 million Jews, I would say, good, we have destroyed an enemy." Doesn't sound like a paper pusher.
You kind of left the critical piece out of your account of what happened with Eichmann.
I think this is sufficient to bring home the point.
Excuse me. I'm responding now.
Go ahead.
Okay, there was a trial in between the point that he was taken by the Mossad from Argentina and the point in Israel he was hanged. And in that trial, they never found Adolf Eichmann guilty or even really attempted to prosecute Eichmann for killing a single Jew.
You're drawing a distinction between actually turning on the gas and ordering it.
He made it possible for that to happen without directly. Of course he did. Yes, that's my point on the Little Eichmanns.
I mean, it's very clear what he did. I mean, he was the one who recommended the use of Zyklon B for the gassing of the Jews and took steps to supply all of it to the camps. You can't say he doesn't have blood on his hands just because he wasn't the one who turned on the gas when he made sure it got there. That's the man you're comparing the dead Americans to.
Thank you. You just made my point perfectly. You do not have to be the one who turned on the gas if you're making it possible for the gas to be there and someone to turn the knob. If you're part of that process, lending your proficiencies to making it more efficient, you are culpable in the process.
So you see a moral equivalence between the man who did that and said, I'm happy, I'll gladly jump into my grave knowing that all these Jews have died like animals. That's the same thing, the same mentality as the victims of Al-Qaeda in those Twin Towers had. That's your point?
Insofar as you lend your proficiency knowingly to a process that results in the mass immiseration and miserable death of third world brown-skinned children for profit maximization, it's not mysterious. Okay? When you do that, you're part of that process, which is a process of just routinely and continuously inflicting carnage on others, identifiable others. Yeah, essentially you're the moral equivalent of Eichmann.
On the other hand, you thought that the dead Americans were just like the Nazis. However, you had nothing but praise for the 9/11 hijackers. You called them courageous, even gallant. Gallant? Al-Qaeda, the guys who flew those jets into the Twin Trade Centers. In 3 minutes, Professor Churchill answers that question. And then I'll ask him about an apology to the 9/11 families. And wait until you see what happens.